Well, it's July 2, 2016. And there is a choice to be made today. Now, lest you think that Pastor Henley has totally lost the plot, I'm not talking about Malcolm or Bill or Richard or Pauline. It's a much more important choice than that. It's a choice that we have to make every day of our lives. The choice is this: whether we will be motivated by fear or whether we will open our hearts to the love and friendship of Jesus. That's the most important choice. And we have to make it every day of our lives. Fear or love. When it comes down to it, that is what the great controversy is actually all about. Whether we'll get involved in cycles of fear and violence, or whether we will become involved in simply receiving and giving the love and friendship of Jesus. So this morning I want to spend a little time thinking about how that might actually play out in real life. So guys, if I can have that first slide up. Here's the writer of Hebrews talking about Jesus and what he has done for us. The slide will do better than me. It was necessary for Jesus to be like us, his brothers and sisters, so that he could be our merciful and faithful high priest. For since he himself has been through suffering and testing, he knows what it is like when we suffer and are tested. And he is wonderfully able to help us. So this morning I want to look at the actual details of what that means. The one who has been through suffering and testing and is therefore able to help us. And for the text that I want to focus on this morning, it's just 7 words. Second slide there, please, guys. Out of Egypt I called my son. These words are from probably the best known story in the whole of the New Testament, the Christmas story. And when Matthew is talking about the Christmas story and the birth of Jesus, he includes these words from the Old Testament: out of Egypt I called my son. And we might ask, what was that really all about? Well, the story starts when Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Joseph and Mary had come to Bethlehem to be registered because Caesar Augustus, like all good politicians, wanted a head count of everybody in the kingdom so that he would know who to tax. And Joseph and Mary had gone to Bethlehem because that was their ancestral home. And while there, Jesus was born. After he was born, they stayed on there, probably intending to continue to live there. This little town of Bethlehem, 8 kilometres from Jerusalem. Jerusalem, the city of peace. The difficulty was that in Jerusalem there was a fellow by the name of Herod who called himself the Great. Herod the Great. You've probably heard of him in the Christmas story, and he's the quintessential bad guy. Let me give you a little detail about Herod. One of his contemporaries was a fellow by the name of Caesar Augustus. Caesar had this to say about Herod: it would be better to be Herod's pig than Herod's son. didn't have a very high opinion of Herod. Let me tell you why. See, Herod actually wasn't a Jew at all. He was an Edomite. And he professed to have been converted to Judaism, but basically it was simply to get the people on side. You see, what had happened is that he had come to power in Judea over the slaughter of virtually the whole of the ruling family of Judea, the Hasmoneans. And he was hated by the Jewish people. So he decided that he would try to pacify the Jewish people, and he would build this magnificent temple, which he did. He decided he'd like to get Caesar on board too, so he built this wonderful port city called Caesarea. But nothing could undo the hatred that his people had for him, for the slaughter of the Hasmoneans. There was one Hasmonean in particular who hated him, one of the few who survived. Her name was Mariamne, and she was a very beautiful young woman, and Herod had become totally besotted with her, and he married her. She was one of his 10 wives. A number of his wives he'd had executed, others he had divorced, but Mariamne was different. She was his favourite wife. But as you can imagine, Herod had slaughtered practically everybody in her family. So what do you think she thought of Herod? She was married to him, but she hated him, she detested him. And he wasn't quite sure whether he could trust her. He had to make a trip to Rome on one occasion to get Caesar's support for some particular matter. And so he left Mariamne at home in Jerusalem under the care of his uncle Joseph. While he was away, there were some of his enemies started plotting, and so they let it be known that, while he was away, Mariamne had cheated on him with his uncle Joseph. Well, Herod was pretty angry about this, so he had Joseph put to death, and he locked up Mariamne while he thought about this and wondered what he would do. Eventually he decided that she had to go. So she too was executed, and the two of his sons, who he also suspected of being unfaithful, plotting against him, so he had them executed as well. Hence Caesar Augustus' comment, "You'd better be Herod's pig rather than his son." He was a detestable character. He made arrangements so that when he died, nobody would forget the date of his death. And so he arranged that there would be 100 or so Jewish leaders who would be killed during his funeral procession. He was a nasty piece of work. A few years after Mariamne and his two sons had been put to death, there were some visitors arrived in Jerusalem. They'd come from the east. They arrived in Jerusalem and said, "We want to see your leader." They came to Herod and said, "Where is he who was born the King of the Jews?" Well, what do you think Herod's reaction was to that? Herod, who would do anything to maintain his position, who would kill his favourite wife, who would put his sons to death, who would have 100 Jewish leaders put to death so people wouldn't forget the date of his funeral. This is the guy these wise men come and say, "Where is he who is born the King of the Jews?" Well, he was furious, he was frightened. He'd spent his whole life trying to prop up his kingdom by means of violence. And this news was about as bad as it could get. But calming his exterior appearance, he said, well, I need to find out. So he called in the Jewish scholars and said, where is the Messiah going to be born? In Bethlehem of Judea. It's in Bethlehem, he told the wise men. And once you've found him, come back and see me so that I can go and worship him too. The wise men set off. The star was there in the sky again. They followed the star. They found the baby Jesus, probably by this time close to 2 years of age. They gave him their gifts. And then they were about to set off back to Herod when they had a dream. Don't go and see Herod, go home by another route. So Joseph and Mary are there in Bethlehem. They have these gifts that the wise men have given. And it's just as well, because that very night, Joseph has a dream. Get up, Joseph. Take the young child and his mother and go to Egypt because the king wants to kill him. I don't think Joseph got up and thought, oh, gee, in the middle of the night, I'll wait till morning. No, he wakes Mary and he says, the angel of the Lord has spoken to me. He's told me that Herod wants to kill Jesus. It's only 8 kilometres to Jerusalem, to Herod's temple, and to the guards and the soldiers. We've got to get out of here, and we've got to get out now. And so they made the journey, about 120 kilometres to the border of Egypt. Fortunately, in those days, there was no requirement for visas. There was no border security. They just crossed over into Egypt, and they stayed there for about a year. And then the angel of the Lord came to Joseph again and said, Joseph, you can go home again. Herod is dead. So Joseph calls Mary and says, okay, dear, we can go back home. On the way back, he discovered that one of Herod's sons, a fellow by the name of Archelaus, was ruling in Jerusalem. And he knew about Archelaus. He was as cruel and bloodthirsty as his father, but without any of his father's administrative ability. And so he thought to himself, there is no way that I want to go back to Bethlehem with that fellow 8 kilometres away. Let's go and find some other place to live. So they chose this little backwater town called Nazareth. And that's where Jesus was brought up. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to understand what was happening. We see the kind of thing that Joseph and Mary and Jesus were going through on our television screens almost every day. Jesus was too young to understand the political situation, but he was certainly not too young to feel the fear that was gripping his parents. The fear that drove them out of Israel to Egypt, the fear of coming home. This is the kind of thing that refugees and displaced people experience on a daily basis. Folks, there are in the world today 65 million people displaced. They can't stay home because of the danger they face. So when Jesus tells us, I understand the weakness I understand the testing that people have to go through. I think he probably has in mind, especially people who are fleeing for their lives because of the dreadful regimes under which they live. Jesus knows what this is like. And so I want to say especially to the people among us who are refugees, people who've had to leave their home and go somewhere else, people probably like Mary and Joseph who get down there to Egypt and they hear the stories about their friends and relatives whose little children have been slaughtered by Herod's soldiers, and the grief that's just overwhelming them. This is the kind of stuff that refugees today and asylum seekers and displaced people, that's what they have to cope with. June 20, just gone, 12 days ago. June 20 was World Refugee Day. Australia's Refugee Week ended last Sabbath. This is the kind of thing that should possibly grip us as Christians because we are the followers of Jesus, the refugee. But I want to take a second look at this verse. Out of Egypt I called my son. Matthew is quoting the Old Testament. He's quoting about another refugee who was called out of Egypt. You see, Joseph had gone down to Egypt and he'd become the great saviour of Egypt. He had told Pharaoh what to do. Gather the grain for 7 years, put it away in storehouses, so there will be food for Egypt and for the whole world. But after it was all over, the Hebrews were beginning to multiply. Pharaoh was getting worried. All the baby boys who were born have to be thrown into the River Nile and drowned. This was a terrible, terrible situation for people to live in. And the story is this. Exodus chapter 3. And God meets Moses down there in the desert. And he says, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. So I've come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So Moses, you are to go down to Egypt. You are to go down to Egypt and you are going to go into Pharaoh's court and you are going to say to him, Pharaoh, this is what the Lord says. Israel is my firstborn son. Let my son go. You know the story. The 10 plagues. And eventually Pharaoh lets them go and they set off, marching through the wilderness toward the promised land. And that Exodus, that event, has become the paradigm of what it means to be a Christian. We are all refugees, all of us. None of us actually belong in the world as it is. The writer to Hebrews puts it this way. Here we find no continuing city, but we look for a city that has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. And God himself tells us about what the foundations of this city are. The foundations of this city, he says, are love and justice. Love and justice. You know, there is no such thing as peace without justice. And there is no such thing as justice without love. So we as Christians are followers of Jesus, the refugee, leading a band of refugees from this world toward the city of God. Folks, this is our heritage. This is our destiny. This is what we are called for. Luke chapter 1. Next slide, please, guys. This is the words of the father of John the Baptist. When John was born, he is so excited because he's at last got his voice back. You remember when the angel said, "You're going to have a son," he said, "How can I know that's going to happen? I'm old, my wife is old." The angel says, "Well, you're not going to be able to speak until this actually takes place." John was born, the neighbours come in, and he says, "You, my child, will be called a prophet of the Most High, for you will go on before the Lord to prepare the way for him, to give his people the knowledge of salvation through the forgiveness of their sins." Full stop. Not the forgiveness of their sins plus something they have to do. God forgives. That is the word of the gospel. But why? Why does God forgive? Because of the tender mercy of our God. That's the because of the gospel. And then there's the how, by which the rising sun will come to us from heaven to shine on those living in darkness and the shadow of death. Put up your hand, please, if you're one of those people who is not living in the shadow of death. You're not going to die. I think all of us, every man jack of us, is included in this. Those living in the darkness and the shadow of death. The living know that they will die. And then to guide our feet into the path of peace. Peace is that situation where everybody is safe, secure, can have a decent life. That's what God intends for us. That's what God intends for the entire world. And it is our heritage, it is our destiny to be at the vanguard, following our leader, Jesus, the refugee, and calling on other people to join us. That is ours. Go out into the world and be that person.